The rain had a way of making everything look broken. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold window of the downtown bus, watching the city blur into streaks of gray and gold. She was crying, but the rain made it easier to pretend she wasn't. 27 years old, unemployed for 6 months and 3 days away from eviction. The letter from her landlord sat crumpled in her coat pocket. Each word a tiny knife she'd read so many times she had them memorized. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay in that empty apartment anymore, surrounded by boxes she couldn't afford to move and memories she couldn't afford to keep. When the bus jerked to a stop at 5th and Main, Sarah got off without thinking. The rain soaked through her jacket immediately, but she barely noticed. Her feet carried her down the familiar street where she used to work, past the coffee shop where she'd celebrated her promotion, past the office building where she'd lost everything when the company downsized. She was drowning, and nobody even knew she was underwater. That's when she saw her. An elderly woman stood hunched beneath the awning of a closed bookstore, trying to shield a small cardboard box from the downpour. She wore a thin purple sweater that had seen better decades, and shoes that were more holes than leather. Her white hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her hands shook as she clutched the box tighter. Sarah stopped walking. Something about the woman's determined grip on that battered box, the way she stood there alone while everyone else rushed past, made Sarah's own problems feel suddenly less enormous. "Ma'am?" Sarah called out, jogging over. "Are you okay? Can I help you?" The woman looked up, and Sarah found herself staring into the kindest eyes she'd ever seen. They were pale blue, webbed with wrinkles, but bright with something that looked like hope struggling against the odds. "Oh, sweetie, you're getting soaked," the woman said, her voice thin but warm. "I'm all right, just waiting for the rain to ease up a bit. Gotta get these over to the shelter." She tilted the box slightly, and Sarah saw it was full of sandwiches, wrapped carefully in plastic bags that the woman had clearly saved and reused many times. "The shelter?" Sarah asked. "Which one?" "Grace House, about 8 blocks that way." The woman pointed east with a trembling finger. "I make sandwiches twice a week. They're expecting me, but my daughter couldn't pick me up today. And the buses don't run this route on Sundays anymore." She smiled, but Sarah could see the exhaustion behind it. "I'll wait it out." Sarah looked at this stranger, this elderly woman who probably had every reason to stay home and protect herself from the rain, from the cold, from the difficulty of the world, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Here was someone who had less than nothing, giving away what little she had. Here was someone still fighting to be kind in a world that probably hadn't been very kind to her. "Let me carry them," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "I'll walk with you." The woman's eyes widened. "Oh, no, honey, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Sarah said, taking the box gently from the woman's arms. "I want to, please." They walked together through the rain, slowly because the woman's legs weren't what they used to be. Sarah learned her name was Margaret, that she was 81 years old, that she'd been making sandwiches for the shelter for 15 years, ever since her husband died and she needed something to keep living for. She learned that Margaret lived on $987 a month from Social Security, that she spent half of that on ingredients for her sandwiches, that her daughter worked 2 jobs and couldn't always help. "Why do you do it?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "When it's so hard." Margaret stopped walking and looked at her with those luminous eyes. "Because someone did it for me once when I needed it most. And because if I can make one person's day a little less heavy, then maybe they'll do the same for someone else someday. Kindness isn't expensive, sweetie. It's just rare." Sarah felt tears mixing with the rain on her face again. But they were different tears now. When they reached Grace House, Sarah helped Margaret inside and watched as the people in the shelter greeted her like she was royalty. A young man with tired eyes and a grateful smile took the sandwiches. A mother with 2 small children hugged Margaret gently. The shelter director, a stout woman named Rosa, shook her head with affection. "Margaret, you're soaked through. Let me get you some dry clothes." "I'm fine, Rosa," Margaret said, but she was shivering. Sarah stood there, dripping on the linoleum, and felt something shift inside her. These people, Margaret with her sandwiches, Rosa with her shelter, the mother trying to keep her children safe, they were all fighting. They were all holding on, just like her. And somehow, even in their struggling, they were still reaching out to help each other. "Do you need volunteers?" Sarah heard herself ask. Rosa looked up, surprised. "Always. You interested?" Sarah thought about her empty apartment, her empty days, her empty bank account. She thought about the eviction, notice in her pocket, and the despair that had brought her onto that bus with nowhere to go. Then she looked at Margaret, who was worth 1,000,000 of Sarah's former co-workers, and nodded. "I am." That was 6 months ago. Sarah stood now in front of her laptop, reading the email for the third time. The non-profit organization she'd been volunteering with, helping to manage Grace House's social media and fundraising, wanted to hire her. It was a real job, with a real salary. Not much, but enough. More than enough, because it came with purpose. She'd been living with Margaret for 4 months. When Rosa learned Sarah was being evicted, she mentioned it to Margaret, who immediately offered her spare room without hesitation. Sarah had cried and refused at first, but Margaret had been insistent. "Sweetie, that room's been empty for 5 years. You'd be doing me a favor. I hate eating dinner alone." Living with Margaret had changed everything. Sarah learned that the elderly woman volunteered at 3 different organizations, that she wrote letters to lonely people in nursing homes, that she spent her evenings knitting blankets for homeless shelters. Sarah learned that heroism wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet and steady, showing up in a purple sweater even when your feet hurt and making sandwiches even when you could barely afford your own groceries. Sarah had started helping with the sandwiches. Then she'd started organizing donation drives. Then she'd created a social media campaign that had gone viral, raising $50,000 for Grace House in 1 month. She'd found her purpose in the last place she'd expected, in the wreckage of her old life, in the kindness of a stranger, in the realization that sometimes you find yourself by losing everything and starting over. Now, as she sat at the small kitchen table in Margaret's warm apartment, typing her acceptance email, Margaret shuffled in with 2 cups of tea. "Good news?" the old woman asked, setting a cup in front of Sarah. "I got the job," Sarah said, and her voice broke slightly. "The one at Grace House. I'm their new community outreach coordinator." Margaret's face lit up like sunrise. She reached across the table and took Sarah's hand, her fingers thin and papery but strong. "Oh, sweetie, I'm so proud of you. But I'm not surprised. You've got a gift for bringing people together." "I learned from the best," Sarah said, squeezing back. That night, Sarah lay in bed in the room that had saved her life and thought about that rainy day 6 months ago. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up entirely, how the weight of her failures had nearly crushed her. She thought about how one moment of choosing to see someone else's struggle instead of just her own had changed everything. Margaret had taught her that kindness was a practice, not just a feeling. That showing up mattered. That every small act of generosity rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or measure. That sometimes the people who had the least to give gave the most freely. Sarah had been drowning that day, and Margaret had pulled her to shore without even knowing it. By carrying a box of sandwiches, by being someone who still believed in helping, by showing Sarah that life wasn't just about surviving, it was about what you did with your surviving, who you helped along the way, what light you brought to someone else's darkness. The rain started again outside, gentle against the window, and Sarah smiled. She thought about all the people she'd meet at her new job, all the stories she'd hear, all the ways she could help amplify voices that needed amplifying. She thought about Margaret asleep down the hall, probably already dreaming up next week's sandwich menu. She thought about the mother and her children from that first day at Grace House, who now had their own apartment thanks to the fundraiser. She thought about how we save each other, every single day, in ways both big and small. How kindness was never wasted, even when it felt too small to matter. How one person caring could change everything. For someone who thought no one cared at all, Sarah had gone looking for nothing that rainy Sunday, and she'd found everything that mattered. She'd found her purpose in helping an old woman carry sandwiches through the rain. She'd found her family in a stranger who'd opened her home. She'd found herself in the practice of showing up, of reaching out, of choosing again and again to be someone who added light instead of just cursing the darkness. And tomorrow she'd wake up and do it all again, because that's what Margaret had taught her. That's what real heroes did. They showed up. They made sandwiches. They carried boxes for strangers. They opened doors and hearts. They kept going, kept giving, kept believing that every act of kindness mattered. Because it did. Because Margaret had proven it to her on the worst day of her life. Because love, Sarah now understood, was just kindness practiced over and over until it became who you were. And she was learning to be someone Margaret would be proud of. Someone who helped carry other people's boxes through the rain. Who noticed when someone was struggling. Who understood that we're all just trying to make it to shelter. And the least we can do is help each other get there safely. The rain fell softer now, almost like a lullaby. And Sarah closed her eyes and slept the sleep of someone who'd finally found their way home.